Hello, my name's Roger Watson and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education in Practice. And I'm going to talk here for 10 minutes or so about writing the final section of a manuscript, by which I mean the discussion section, which probably will include a conclusion as well. But anyway, it's the end section of a manuscript. Now, the discussion section of a manuscript can be quite long, because this is where you're pulling everything together, and it will probably be quite broad. So I've already described how the introduction is broad in a paper, then you narrow down to through the background to the results, and then the methods sections. The discussion section begins to broaden things out again, and it's referring back to it's explaining what you found, it's referring back to the literature that you looked at in the background, it's trying to explain what's new, it's also trying to evaluate the study and to point to any future directions for research. And it should contain a conclusion section, which I will come to at the end. So one of the biggest problems that people have and often express to me is, how do I begin to write a discussion section? Not only what's in the discussion section, but how do I begin? It's all very well to introduce your study and to give the background, describe the methods, which should be very easy because that's what you're doing, and to explain the results. But people often get stuck when it comes to beginning the discussion section. So I'll speak about this first of all before we get into other details. And I think if you're not entirely sure how to start a discussion section, then it's quite permissible to restate what you were doing in the study, restate the aim of the study. So this study set out to investigate something, and by using a randomized controlled trial, and we found the following, and to state three findings. And that's usually the first sentence of your discussion complete. So you're saying this study set out to investigate how better to prepare health professionals for working with older people, and using a randomized controlled trial of an educational intervention, something like that. We found that nurses responded better to the intervention than doctors, or we found that women were more likely to benefit from it than men. I'm just making this up, but and that that overall there was an effect of the educational intervention. So three things. What you can then do with those three findings is you can use them to structure the rest of your discussion. You can actually use them as subheadings. So you could put differences between nurses and doctors. You could put differences between gender, and then something, then a final section about the general effectiveness of the intervention. So you don't really have to think too much about what to do. Restate what you've done, give a brief summary of the main findings, and then use those findings to structure the rest of your discussion. So that's a sort of general way to start it and to give it a structure. But within that discussion, there should be reference back to the original research that you mentioned in your background. So I think it's always useful to think of a discussion as like closing the loop. That's the background, that's your discussion. What you're going to do is go round and close the loop. You're going to go back and reflect on that. And what you're going to try to explain to your reader, and you've got a great deal of, you can use not your imagination, but you've got a great deal of freedom here to express the outcomes of the study as you want. But you should be trying to say, did this aspect of the study work or did it not? Did we manage to show this or did we not? And to what extent, and what does it mean? So don't in your introduction, you may introduce some new literature. If something unusual has been found, it may reflect on someone else's theory or some other piece of research which wasn't mentioned in the background. But try to introduce new literature sparingly. Don't introduce too much of it. So you may introduce some new literature, but really you should be making sure that you look back at the background and being sure that you address all the points that you raised there. So that really is the purpose of the discussion, is to evaluate, did the study work, the extent to which it worked, and if it didn't necessarily show you that your intervention was as good as you expected it to be, why might that be? Now, within the discussion section, it's good to have other subheadings, not only the ones that I've mentioned already based on the results, but it's almost inevitable that you will have to have a limitations section and possibly a conclusion section within it. Some journals, again, like the introduction and background being either separate or together, some journals may ask you for a separate conclusion section. If they do, you write a separate conclusion, which I'll come to. If not, you make the conclusion a subheading of the discussion. So before that, you should always mention sort of limitations of the study. What you shouldn't do is undermine your study, but you've got to appreciate that some things may not have worked as well, or the method may not be entirely appropriate, or it may not be completely generalizable. So any limitations that are apparent, for instance, you aimed to find 500 participants and you only got 300, for example. You tried to sample randomly and discovered that the sample was biased, for example, for some reason. So anything that you've noticed that you think might influence the results and the way that you've interpreted the results. So don't hide the limitations. It's a very good thing to do, to share the limitations, because it helps other people to notice that and to design their studies better. And then another section before you get to the conclusion, and it's good to flag these things up and indicate them with a subheading, is a section saying future directions for research. So you've found out a certain amount, but what's next? What does this point to? Or if your study was meant to test an intervention and it didn't seem to be very good, you've got to indicate there, well, there may be better ways of doing it. It may be because of the limitations, but we need to design better interventions. There's still an imperative to do that, and that's a future line of research. And it may well be your future line of research, because you may use that to base your next grant application on. So you've got to think about writing your paper strategically like that. So you'll have your main discussion with sections on the main results. Then you should always mention limitations, and then you should have something about future directions for research. And finally, you will be required to write some kind of conclusion. And my advice for conclusions is that they should be very short. They certainly shouldn't be more than a few hundred words long, maybe a couple of hundred words long, 200 words long at the very most. And the conclusion should reflect back on the study, and in a sense it should it's a kind of very short summary. I mean, you've already got a summary in the abstract, you've already explained it in the discussion, and you may think, well, why do we need a conclusion to also tell us again? But there is an old saying about trying to explain things to people, is tell them what you're going to tell them it, and tell them again, and you can use the conclusion to tell people again what you've done. But don't repeat the abstract, don't repeat the discussion. Pull out what you consider to be the main points from your study. And I'm very keen in conclusions on using bullet points. So the three main findings from this study were 3 bullet points, what the consequences of that are, and then briefly again maybe restate what the future lines of inquiry will be. So that's what to do in a conclusion. One thing that I don't think you should do in a conclusion is to use any references. You're referring back to the work, not to the references, so don't use any references there. And don't start speaking about something other than a study. Don't take off again into a new line of thought. Make sure that it concludes your study and that it doesn't make any further reference outside of the study. So in these sessions, the ones that preceded this, we've looked at every aspect of an academic paper, from the title through the abstract, introduction and background, through the methods, and then to the results. And in this final session, we've looked at the end of the paper, the discussion and the conclusion section. And so that's apart from making sure that you put your references in and then have your paper looked at again and proofread and remember the 4 rules of writing. That's really everything that I want to say, first of all, about a discussion, and in total, everything I want to say about the structure of an academic manuscript. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope you found the previous sessions useful. And once again, thank you very, very much for listening.